Hello, Mystery Nox listeners. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Kim.
And I'm Mary.
And if this is your first time joining us, welcome. We hope you enjoy the episode and we hope you'll become part of the Mystery Nox family. On today's episode, we are going to discuss the mysterious disappearance of the Sodder children. Step back in time with us to the year 1945, Christmas Eve night in West Virginia. The Sodder family went to bed just like any other night, but this night would be different. Unfortunately, it would be the last time the Sodders saw 5 of their 10 children ever again. It all started with a house fire and ended in one of the most mysterious disappearances of this century. This is the case of the Sodder children. So, Mary, what did you think about this case?
No, it was interesting, this story, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I'd never heard of it, much like every other case we've done.
That we've done.
Which is good, because then you're, learning something new.
Uh-huh, exactly. Yeah, it was definitely interesting. It's interesting that in pretty much every single case that we do, the police just do a horrible job.
That's what I was thinking, too, when I was doing my part, the research on it.
Yeah.
I was like, this is the third or fourth one where the police are just like, nah, I'm good.
Yeah.
It's like, why did you get into that line of duty?
Yeah, I found it interesting as I was researching this story, and I was like, again, with the police just not doing their job like they should have.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a common theme in pretty much all of the cases that we've done where the police are involved, is crappy police work.
Mm-hmm.
And no wonder they're unsolved. So that was basically the biggest thing that I noticed during this case, but let's get into it. Christmas is supposed to be a happy time. It should be the most exciting day of the year for children, waking up to an abundance of new toys, knowing Santa was just there in your house dropping off gifts because you certainly weren't on the naughty list. It's usually a day of joy and family gatherings with food and conversation. Unfortunately, on this day in 1945, that wasn't the case for the Sodder family. At 1 a.m. on Christmas Day, Jenny Sodder woke up to a horror show, a sight that no parent wants to ever see. Their house was on fire, and she had 9 children she had to find, wake up, and get out of the house, all before they perished in the fire. She did have 10 children, but one of her sons was away in the military at the time. The events that followed would call into question the validity of the outcome of the investigation. So many things went wrong that night, but why? Was it just a series of unfortunate events? Or was there something more sinister at play? However, before we deep dive into what happened that night, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Sodders. George Sodder and Jenny Cipriani both immigrated to the United States from Italy when they were still children. Jenny was 3 and came over with her family. George was 13 and had traveled with an older brother to the United States, but as soon as they reached Ellis Island, his brother left George alone and went back to Italy. George's real name was Giorgio Soddu, but like many immigrants before him, his name was changed to better assimilate in the U.S. George ended up finding work on the Pennsylvania railroads and then eventually moved to West Virginia. According to Karen Abbott from Smithsonian Magazine, George was described as being, quote, smart and ambitious. He first worked as a driver and then launched his own trucking company, hauling dirt for construction and later freight and coal. One day, he walked into a local store called the Music Box and met the owner's daughter, Jenny Cipriani, end quote. George and Jenny ended up getting married, settled in Fayetteville, West Virginia, and between 1923 and 1943, they ended up having 10 children.
God.
I know. I can't even imagine having 10 children. I only have 2, and that's more than enough for me.
And I don't even have any, and just a thought of one.
Yeah, I mean, but I guess that was normal back then, to have a lot of children, so... But still, 10 children, my God. John was the oldest. He was 23. And then there was Joseph, or Joe, 21. Marion, 17. George Jr., 16. Maurice, 14. Martha, 12, Louis or Louis, I'm not sure, 9, Jenny, 8, Betty, 5, and Sylvia is either 3 or 2 by some sources, so we don't have an exact age on Sylvia. The Sodders were a typical middle-class family, being described as well-liked by the community. One country magistrate described the Sodders as, quote, one of the most respected middle-class families around, end quote. George was also described as having very strong opinions on everything from politics to business, and this will come into play later on in the case. But overall, the Sodders were just your average, well-liked family. The only curious thing about George is he refused to talk about his past in Italy. He never said why he immigrated to the United States, and from the research I've read, it seems like George wanted to keep his past in the past and start over, which he did. Well, we were kind of talking about this before, about why his brother just left him once they got to America. I mean, he was only 13.
He was like, hands are clean, dumped you off, leaving you.
Yeah, and his older brother's like, see ya, I'm going back to Italy. So
dropping off the problem in someone else's court.
Right. So it does make you wonder, like, why were they so, I don't know, ready to just, get rid of him, basically, drop him off in America and leave him there by himself. But he never talked about it, so.
I mean, it could have been just like one of those things where he was just, just legitimately making sure his brother got there.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's all, like, he wanted to do.
Yeah, it's hard for me to fathom that, because it's like, he was 13. You're dropping him off in a new country. Like, I just could never leave my siblings. But that is definitely part of the mystery to this case. So that takes us back to Christmas Eve. That night, the kids had opened a few gifts and asked their parents if they could stay up a little bit later so they could play with them. Jenny agreed and headed up to bed with Sylvia. According to reports, this was around 10:30 p.m. Before she left to go to bed, she reminded Louis and Maurice to close the chicken coop and bring in the cows before they went to bed. The children that were left awake downstairs while their parents slept were Marion, Louis, Maurice, Martha, Jenny, and Betty. The youngest, Sylvia, went to bed when her mother did. John and Joe were already in bed asleep, along with their father, George. At 12:30, Jenny heard the phone ring. She got up to answer it, and it was a woman on the other line. According to an article from Nathan Jolly from news.au, the caller asked for someone who didn't live at the house, laughed in a way Jenny would later recall as weird, and was drowned out by the clinking of glasses and background laughter. When she got up, she noticed Marion asleep on the couch, but the front door was unlocked and the lights were still on. This was odd. The kids never did this, but Jenny just assumed that they were asleep in bed. Unfortunately, she never checked on them. Jenny shut and locked the front door and turned off the lights and headed back to bed. So, I don't want it to seem like I'm blaming Jenny when I say that she just assumed that they were asleep, because I'm not blaming her. But I just wanted to make it clear that she never checked on them, because that's a big part of this case. We don't know if the kids were in the house when the fire started.
But see,
and that's a huge part of the case.
Yeah, but the whole, the fact she didn't check on them, that's weird. As a mother's instinct sort of thing, you would think. I mean, in general, you would check on them.
Well, to me, yes, it's weird, because if it was me, I would have checked on the kids, on my kids. Especially because the door was unlocked. But the only thing I can think of is that Marion was down there asleep on the couch. And so she probably thought, oh, since she's here sleeping on the couch, everything's okay. Like, she made sure all the kids were up in their rooms, asleep in bed, because she was 17. She was the older sibling. And basically, she was left in charge, basically, of them. So that was where my mind went when I read that. So she probably assumed that she didn't have to check on them because Marion took care of it. Just as Jenny was drifting back to sleep, she heard a thump on the roof and then a rolling sound. Next thing she noticed was the smell of smoke. According to reports, this was between 1 to 1:30 a.m. George's home office was on fire. Ginny ran to the bedroom to awaken George, and the two of them ran around the house trying to wake up all the children and get them to safety. The hallways were filled with smoke, and the staircase that led to the children's bedrooms was on fire. So George and Ginny yelled upstairs for the children to get out. However, they heard nothing. No crying, no yelling, no pounding. It was just quiet. George tried to call the fire department, but the phone wasn't working. Once Ginny and George were outside, they saw that 4 of their 9 children were outside and safe. All the children that had stayed up late to play with the toys, except for Marion, were nowhere to be seen. Obviously, George and Ginny panicked, thinking the kids were still trapped inside the house. First, he tried breaking a window to gain access to the house again, but all he saw when he looked in was smoke and fire. While George ran around the side of the house to grab a ladder that he always had propped up against the house, 17-year-old Marion ran to a neighbor's house to call the fire department. But this is when things started to go completely awry. The ladder that George always kept by the house was missing. So then he had the idea to drive one of his trucks up beside the house, gaining access to the roof so he could have access to the bedroom window. But again, things didn't go as planned. The trucks, which were working just fine the day before, would not start. At this point, he was completely panicked and tried to think of any other ideas that would help him recover his children. He decided to try to scoop rainwater out of a barrel, but unfortunately the water was frozen solid. I can't even imagine how desperate he was feeling at this time. According to one report from Smithsonian Magazine, quote, "He didn't notice that his arm was slick with blood, that his voice hurt from screaming their names." End quote. Meanwhile, Marion is at a neighbor's house trying to phone the fire department, but was unable to get an operator on the line. A different neighbor who had seen the blaze also tried to phone the fire department, but also could not reach the operator. This neighbor then decided to drive into town and find the fire chief, which they did. The fire chief, F.J. Morris, then started a phone tree system which acted as Fayetteville's fire alarm at the time. This means that one firefighter phoned another firefighter, who then phoned a different firefighter, and so on.
That's just such a waste of time.
Mm-hmm.
I don't get it.
I don't either. I don't understand why the fire chief couldn't just...
Like, directly call the
Yeah.
person you need to.
I don't know. When I was reading that, I didn't really understand it either, and it just seems like it wastes so much time. But again, it was
time.
1945.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So maybe that's just how they did it back then. I don't know. The fire department didn't arrive at the Sodders' home until 8 a.m., even though they were only 2.5 miles away. I mean, that's crazy. Let's just throw this out there. That's crazy. Because the fire started at 1 a.m. They didn't get there until 8 a.m. 7 hours.
Yeah, and then what, Marion is running around trying to get people and...
Yeah.
See, when they say that it took them that much amount of time and they're only 2.5 miles away, that makes me think there's something more to it. In addition to other stuff that we will cover, but...
We'll cover, yeah.
But I'm just like, no, there's more to it.
I mean, it definitely read suspicious to me because, even with it being 1945, 7 hours. By that time, there was nothing left for them to try to put out. The Sodders' home had burned to the ground, and all that was left was mostly ash. Everyone, including George and Ginny, assumed that the children had died in the fire. But, after firefighters searched the grounds, they found nothing. No remains, not even a trace of bone. Despite this, investigators believe the children had perished in the fire. Death certificates were issued before the new year, stating the cause of death as, quote, "fire or suffocation," end quote. However, due to all the odd details that happened, the Sodders began to wonder, could their children still be alive? After the break, we will go into the details of the strange occurrences that happened leading up to and during the fire, and talk about the theories attributed to this case. Stay with us. Now back to the case.
So let's start out with what exactly were the strange occurrences that happened that got the Sodders and many other townspeople doubting the outcome of this case. When George was trying to rescue his children from the second floor, but couldn't get to them within the house, he tried using a ladder that he had outside. Strangely enough, the ladder, which was usually leaning up against the side of the house, wasn't there. It was later found some 65 feet from the house down an embankment. He also had the idea to move his trucks close to the house so he can get to the second floor, but he wasn't able to do that either as he couldn't get the trucks moved, much less started. If that wasn't suspicious enough, it was noted that there were unexpected visits to the Sodder home by an individual who threatened George when he opted to not give the man business. Quote, "There was a stranger who appeared at the home a few months earlier, back in the fall, asking about hauling work. He meandered to the back of the house, pointed to 2 separate fuse boxes, and said, 'This is going to cause a fire someday.'" End quote. George found the whole thing strange, especially since he just had the wiring checked by the local power company a month prior, which pronounced it in fine condition. Around the same time, another man tried to sell the family life insurance and became irate when George declined. Quote, "Your goddamn house is going to go up in smoke," he warned, "and your children are going to be destroyed. You're going to pay for the dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini." End quote. This man was a prominent Fayetteville community member who George worked for until 1943, when they parted ways. He was the co-signer for the Sodders' home and had increased their insurance from $1,500 to $1,750 without their knowledge. The insurance salesman had also previously tried to convince the Sodders to take out life insurance on their children, but they refused. According to reports, this insurance salesman was never questioned. And as a side note, the insurance salesman also served as a chairman on the coroner's inquest of the fire on December 26, 1945, and deemed the fire accidental.
But do you think the cops were really in on it, or was it more like a mob kind of thing?
Maybe, because back then the mob did have control over the cops. I mean, I'm not sure of that area, but in general, you did hear a lot about that. Going back on that Mussolini comment, while George was not a fan, in fact, he was very open about his feelings regarding Mussolini, which left the Italians in their Italian immigrant community highly divided. People speculated that because of his opinions, the local mafia had kidnapped the children for revenge and money before setting the house on fire. But there is no evidence to substantiate that theory. The bodies of the children were never recovered, as Chief Morris stated. The fire was not hot enough for the bodies to burn and turn to ash. The house had only taken 30 to 45 minutes at most to burn down, and therefore would not generate the heat it would take to turn the bone to ash. Jenny had even contacted a local crematorium to inquire about how long and how hot the fire had to be to turn the bone to ash. She was told, "A 2-hour fire burning at 1100 degrees Celsius would leave human bones intact. The Sodder house burned at a lower temperature and for less than an hour." End quote. Jenny also took it upon herself to see how bones would burn and tested this theory on animal bones. Since there were no bones nor bodies, the Sodders couldn't help but hope they would find their children again. They put up posters and even put out a reward of $5,000, at most reaching to $10,000 for anyone that could return their children. The Sodders even hired a private investigator to help, as the FBI and local police were of no help. However, when the FBI had offered to help, the local police and fire departments declined their offer.
But that's another thing. It's like, you have missing children. Why? Or, some people think they're missing.
Well, regardless, it's like part of your job.
In a fire.
They called you for help.
Right, exactly. So I just think that they closed the case. They were like, yep, they died in the fire, case is closed. And then, they have the family and a lot of other people saying, no, there's no evidence.
Yeah, exactly.
There's nothing to say that they died in the fire. So let's bring the FBI in. And they're like, oh, well, now you're questioning us.
The most prominent leads came in not long after the children were reported missing. It had been reported that a woman had seen the children in the back seat of a car, leaving the scene as the house was on fire. The vehicle had a Florida state license plate. Another sighting had been in a town 50 miles west, a tourist stop between Fayetteville and Charleston, where a woman had seen the children eating breakfast. The children had also been spotted with 2 men and 2 women that appeared to be fluent in Italian. The witnesses had claimed that the, quote, strangers had been hostile when she attempted to speak with the children, end quote, and left no trace of having stayed in the rented room the night before. Other sightings. In one such instance, a neighbor had theorized that the Sodder children had been murdered and dumped into a well by an individual known as the Mad Butcher. Another possible lead came in 1967, where the family had received a letter from a woman in Houston, Texas, who had said she encountered a young man, drunk and claimed to be Louis Sodder. But when George and his son-in-law found the woman who wrote the letter, she refused to talk to him.
Why would you write a letter and send it?
Maybe she was the one that was drunk.
Why would you do that and then, like, not think that they would come and want to talk to you?
I don't know. People do crazy things.
People are... Yeah, okay. I'm not even going to finish that sentence.
Then again, in 1967, Jenny Sodder received a letter postmarked in Central City, Kentucky. Inside was a photograph of a man around the age of 30 who bore a striking resemblance to Louis.
It's actually quite strange, because I'm looking at the picture of Louis when he was 9, and then this picture of this man who they said is around 30.
The eyes and the eyebrows are very prominent, I think.
I was just going to say, yeah, the eyes and the eyebrows. And the ears. Look at the ears. The hair, I mean, the dark hair.
Like, it really could be him.
Yeah, I can definitely see it. And we will put this photo on our blog, and then we can also put it on our Instagram stories as well. Now, the back of the photo says this. Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. LLIL boys. A90132 or 35.
That's weird. Like the numbers, I don't... At first I thought they were maybe a date, but I was like, no, because the year 67... Like, it would be like, what, September 1st? But obviously it's not.
Right. Yeah, I don't... Yeah. I'm not even going to try.
No, yeah, because it'd just drive me crazy.
To figure out what that meant, because, I mean, even the police and a private investigator couldn't figure it out, so...
Well, the police, I'm not really counting on them.
Well, yeah, true. But, you know.
Yeah.
I don't know what it could mean. 32 or 35. 90. Yeah, I don't know.
They couldn't make sense of the letter. They even hired another private investigator to look into it, but he ran away with their money and was never seen again. While the case still remains unsolved, the story still remains active. 60 years on, people are still hoping that one day, the missing Sodder children will appear or the truth will come out as to what happened that night on December 24th, 1945. Sylvia, the youngest and the last known surviving Sodder child, still visits the sites that talk of her missing siblings. She will also occasionally visit the site of which her childhood home had burned to the ground. So,
Mary, what are your
thoughts and ideas
on this case? Yeah. What do you think happened to the Sodder children?
Honestly, I think they were kidnapped. Yeah. I don't think they died in the house. Obviously, no bones were found, no remains of any sort.
I mean, I agree. I think that they were kidnapped. I think that it happened when the boys went out, or, you know, all the children went out to go close the chicken coop and put the cows away. I think that's when they were taken. I think that Marion was already asleep inside, so she didn't notice anything.
Oh, that's probably, yeah. That makes sense as to why the door was left unlocked then.
Yep, because the door was unlocked, which means they didn't come back in the house. The lights were still on. Yeah, I think that's when it happened. And then obviously somebody threw something on their roof and started the fire. You know, that didn't just come out of nowhere. It's just, and then all the things that went wrong, the ladder being taken away,
and the cars or the trucks not being able to turn on, and
and the phone didn't work.
Yeah,
and that was because somebody cut the phone line, right?
Someone cut it.
Yeah, so I mean, come on, you can't tell me with all that evidence, no bodies, no bones, that oh no, they just perished in a fire. It's a lot of possibilities, but I definitely agree with you. I think that they were kidnapped by someone, or maybe many someones, because it was 5 children that they took.
Yeah.
You know, so I think there had to have been more than one person doing this.
And maybe it was someone they knew, because if it wasn't, they would be screaming, right? Like for their parents, for
you
their
would think.
Other brothers and sisters.
Yeah, you would think that one of them would have at least made noise. So it possibly, yeah, it could have been somebody that they knew. And it's just sad that, you know, the parents never found out what happened to them, because obviously they're long passed away.
And they kept searching right up until the end too.
Oh yeah, they never gave up. They never gave up. So, but let us know what you guys think happened to the Sodder children. You can talk to us on our... I was like, are you going to jump in, Mary?
You can send us a message on Anchor or through Facebook or Instagram. We're also on Twitter. Our links can be found on the blog, so we're not just repeating ourselves.
Right. But yeah, we'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on the cases and what you guys think happened. And yeah, we'd love to hear from you. So let us know what you think. And thanks for listening.
All right, Mystery Nox listeners, that's it for our case today. Thank you so much for joining us. As always, we'd love to hear your ideas and or theories on this case, so let us know on our Instagram and Facebook at Mystery Nox Podcast, on Twitter at Mystery Nox Pod, or send us a voice message on anchor.fm/Mystery Nox Podcast. A list of our sources and the pictures from this case can be found on our blog at mysterynoxpodcast.wordpress.com. Your support is always appreciated, so if you enjoyed what you've heard, please let us know by giving us a review on Anchor, Spotify, Apple Podcast, or wherever you listen to your podcast. We'll see you on our next episode, and remember, stay weird, stay curious.
Mischief managed.